Airing on Asheville FM 103.3 LPFM in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian broadcasts and podcast emanating out of occupied Chalagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world, and you can find our archives, transcripts, ways to follow us and support us at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org. This week on the show, we're featuring the voice of an anti-Zionist Jewish anarchist living in lands occupied by the Israeli state. We speak about some of the experiences that he's had of trying to resist the ongoing war against the Palestinians, collaboration with Palestinian comrades against the occupation, the silencing of dissent during the escalation by the Israeli state, and other topics. For a very thoughtful series of podcasts about the situation in Palestine, check out the 2 recent episodes of the It's Going Down podcast featuring Scott Campbell, which are linked in our show notes. Following this, you'll hear a segment by A Radio Berlin, a co-member of the Channel Zero network, as well as the A Radio network with The Final Straw, about repression of anti-fascists recently under the far-right Hungarian administration of Victor Orban. This also appeared in the November 2023 episode of Bad News, Angry Voices from Around the World, which is the monthly English language podcast from the A Radio network. Past and future episodes are up on a-radio-network.org and are also linked in the show notes. The following is a shared announcement between It's Going Down podcast and The Final Straw.
Hello, listeners. If you're listening to this is either on the It's Going Down podcast or you're listening on KPFA. If you're listening on KPFA, you're probably used to at this time hearing It's Going Down. And we just want to let you know, for the foreseeable future, our friends at The Final Straw are going to be taking over this slot. And The Final Straw, we've played a lot of their content over the last couple months. You know, they've been an inspiration to us getting this project started. And we know that if you love It's Going Down, you're going to love The Final Straw. We cover a lot of the same stuff. They even have more of an international focus often than we do. But we just kind of wanted to let everybody know, listeners, hey, thanks for listening to us on KPFA. If you're listening to us on the podcast and you don't listen to us on the radio, and you want to go back and look at kpfa.org and look at our archive, there is some stuff that you may not hear on the podcast version, but a lot of it's a lot similar. And if you want to tune in and hear The Final Straw on Pacifica Radio or on KPFA or on the Channel Zero network, we encourage you to do that. But for anybody listening that hasn't heard of The Final Straw, why don't you just introduce the show?
Hey, I'm Bursts. I'm one of the main hosts at The Final Straw. It's an anarchist radio show that's produced weekly out of North Carolina, out of Asheville, that's been going for near on 14 years now. And yeah, like the gracious host of IGD said, we produce a lot of the same kind of content, sometimes different guests, but yeah, pretty similar conversations. It's long form interviews. Some of our recent subject matter has included interviews with activists just back to the so-called US from Rojava, or hearing from anarcho-feminists in Armenia about the recent violence in Nagorno-Karabakh. I just recorded an interview yesterday, with an anti-Zionist Jewish anarchist in occupied Palestine about how they've been experiencing things there. So a little more of an international flavor, but yeah, similar heart.
Yeah, we want to encourage folks, if you're a longtime listener of It's Going Down on KPFA and you still want to hear the show, you can go to itsgoingdown.org. We're still going to be putting out tons of podcast content. You can still listen to it through our website or wherever you get your podcast. We're just not going to be broadcasting on KPFA. We'll probably still come onto this time slot once in a while with a really juicy show. So be sure to listen. You might hear us once in a while. But again, we want to encourage folks, for the time being, stick around, turn your dial to KPFA or whatever Pacifica radio station is close to you, and make sure you're listening to The Final Straw Wednesdays at 11 a.m. And yeah, we're excited for you all to expand your radio empire. Why don't you tell people where they can hear The Final Straw right now? Because there's a lot of spots.
Yeah, well, if you're not listening online at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org and subscribing to our RSS feed there, or the various streaming platforms like YouTube, You can hear us on WCRS in Columbus, Ohio, KWTF in Santa Rosa, California, KRJF in Santa Rosa, KPCA in Petaluma, California, KWRKLP in Fairbanks, Alaska, WSFM in Asheville, North Carolina, KFUG, which is up in Crescent City, KEPW in Eugene, WGDR in Vermont, KODXLP, WFVR. So a bunch of stations. You can check out our website, thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and find the radio tab. Find if there's a station that's nearby to you that's playing us. But you can hear years and years of backlog episodes at our website as well. And again, lots of thanks to the IGD crew for letting us step into this slot for when needed and playing our content. It's been a huge blessing to us to know that we're going to be able to share the airwaves with you and also broadcast in the wider Bay Area and Los Angeles and Fresno areas.
Awesome. And once again, we want to encourage you to support Pacifica Radio and KPFA if you can during fund drives. And again, if you like It's Going Down and you want to continue to listen to our show, check us out on all podcast platforms. And again, you can go to our website, itsgoingdown.org, to hear the shows there. We've got a lot of content. We've been doing a lot of interviews with activists and people on the ground in occupied Palestine and beyond. So, we're not going to go anywhere. We're going to continue to put out the show. So be sure to check out itsgoingdown.org for more stuff on our end. And listening here, be sure to check out The Final Straw, and we will see you in the streets.
Ciao.
If you want to support The Final Straw Radio, you can subscribe to our podcast via various platforms, follow, rate, and share our materials online, and learn more at tfsr.wtf. And if you'd like to fund our transcription work that allows for easier translation, more accessibility of content, and the zines that we produce from each interview, consider picking up some merch from us or making a one-time or recurring donation via PayPal, Venmo, Stripe, or LibrePay. Or joining our Patreon to access early release content and other goodies via the links that you can find at tfsr.wtf/support.
I wondered if you cared to introduce yourself somehow for the audience with any even anonymized information about yourself, location or your identity, any of those sort of things.
So I was born and have been living all my life in Jerusalem, Al-Quds, Palestine, Israel. I'm an anti-Zionist Jew, and I have been active in joint Palestinian Jewish struggles against occupation and Zionism since 2012. And in recent years, since COVID started, I'm also active in mutual aid and food rescue groups in Jerusalem. Two groups that I've been involved with in the West Bank are the Ayush, which is active in the South Hebron Hills, especially in the area of Masaferiyata, and Free Jerusalem, which is active in Al-Quds, Jerusalem, both in the eastern and western parts of the city.
Are those groups mostly made up of settlers, or are they mixed between Palestinians and Israelis?
Well, the Irish began 20 years ago in the Second Intifada as a joint Jewish-Palestinian group. It used to be much bigger than it is now. It used to be hundreds of people. And over the years, it got smaller and smaller. And during the time that I've been active, I also had breaks in my activism. Like, I wasn't active all the time since 2012, but in the years that I was or have been active with Irish, so there were almost no Palestinians. Like, obviously, the activity itself is shared because we go and stand with Palestinians in the West Bank. But in terms of activists that are a part of the group itself, then these days it's actually only Jews. There was one Palestinian activist that I knew during my time. and Free Jerusalem is pretty much the same. The core, the actual activists. Again, we are being active with Palestinians in Jerusalem, with local activists, but the group itself is almost only Jewish. Like there is one or two Palestinians in it.
So I don't know. Initially, you had introduced yourself as a Jewish anti-Zionist activist from Palestine, rather than as a Palestinian or an Israeli. Can you talk about the complexity of identities a bit in terms of, like, do you identify in that the land, all of the land being occupied Palestine, or are you saying that, I don't know. Can you sort of break that down a little bit?
Generally, I think I usually don't focus so much on identity questions, at least not personally, because I prefer acting with other people on the basis of a shared goal rather than acting based on the shared identity. But the fact remains that I am a Jewish Israeli citizen with all the privileges it gives me under the Zionist colonial regime. We'll probably get soon to some of those privileges, what it means. And I think it's important for most of us as like anti-Zionist Jews to emphasize the difference between Judaism and Zionism. So that's why I prefer to call myself an anti-Zionist Jew rather than Israeli. But, I see this piece of land as well. I'm an anarchist, so it also complicates stuff because obviously I see all of this land as occupied, and I identify with the Palestinian struggle for freedom and for independence. But I don't believe in states in general, so it's not like I dream about a one Palestinian state instead of one Israeli state. Like it's not. Also, over the years, it became harder and harder to imagine the future here, like concretely. Like the solution is two state or one state. I think we lost the interest in this kind of conversation because we'd rather be focused on the little stuff that we can do and the solidarity and creating connections for a better future. Like I said, in general, I support the Palestinian struggle for freedom, and it means also the return of the refugees to their homes, also within the 48 borders, like what is called now the State of Israel, not just in the occupied territories. And it's all over, like where I live in Jerusalem. Many neighborhoods used to be Palestinian before 48, also in the other big cities, Tel Aviv, Jaffa, Haifa, and many, many, many places. I do believe that all of these places should return in some way to the people who used to live there and their descendants. And I hope that we can still coexist somehow.
I wonder if you could talk about a shared Palestinian and Israeli struggle against the occupation of Palestine as you've experienced it over the last few years, or at least since 2012. But particularly, I'm interested about the last few years. Is this struggle possible anymore amidst this onslaught?
So maybe I'll start with a disclaimer, because I think the general stance of me and my activist friends, communities, that this current Israeli government, as fascist and murderous as it is, didn't bring anything really new. We're not doing an history class, but this state was established with the Nakba, the ethnic cleansing of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, which never stopped to this day. So I say this disclaimer because it is true that not only since the war, but since this new government came to power about a year ago, the situation did get worse, and the ethnic cleansing methods in the West Bank got more extreme, but still it's important to stress that it's the same methods that got more extreme. It's not new methods, and it's not a new goal of this regime to ethnically cleanse Palestine. It's they only changed how they do it and how extremely they do it. But anyway, if we talk about how our solidarity activity used to be in the last few years, so we usually used to go and accompany shepherds and farmers in the West Bank, especially in two areas that are called Masafayata and Jordan Valley, areas where many shepherds and farmers were denied access to their lands by both army and settlers. Or we used to go and document home demolitions or demolitions of water sources, sometimes help preparing and building infrastructure, or help with the olive harvest, all kinds of standing with Palestinians. Also, in a major part of the solidarity activism was joining Palestinian demonstrations across the West Bank. If you heard about Anarchists Against the Wall, we used to join these demonstrations for years, and sadly are not active anymore. And of course, there was always much violence, both by army and settlers, because this violence is inherent to the occupation, especially when we talk about the demonstrations in the West Bank, in which dozens were killed over the years, in places like Bilain, Yalin, Nabi Saleh, Beta, Dajan, and there is a long list. However, in the last year or so, activists started to get calls from communities to stay 24/7 for protective presence in villages due to increased army and settler violence. And I'm stressing the word army before settlers because it's important to clarify that settler violence is a tool of the Zionist colonial regime and not an extreme part of it. And also, many times it's hard to tell between soldiers and settlers because they cooperate and they come together to attack. And these days it's even harder to differentiate between them because they all dress the same and they both have weapons. So it's like two tools of the state. One is the military, and one is like citizens who have weapons, but they cooperate. So over the last year or so, small communities that we used to be active with in the ways that I mentioned were forced to leave their homes because of the increased violence and because their lives were in danger. If we can mention some names of villages, then Simri and Widade in Masafayata and South Hebron Hills area, and in Samia, Rasutin, and Kabun in the Jordan Valley and the area east of Ramallah. So all of that was even before the war started, before October 7th. It's still early to tell, but since October 7th, at least 13 more communities, 1,000 people, were forced to leave their homes in the West Bank because of this increased violence, even more increased. And that's according to statistics from B'Tselem. Obviously, it's just a start. We don't know where it's heading. And I personally wasn't on the ground as much in recent weeks, but friends who were on the ground had to see in front of their eyes communities that they know personally and have been standing with. They had to see them leaving their homes, being subjected to violence. And if we talk about East Jerusalem, so since 2009, every week there is a demonstration in a neighborhood called Sheikh Jarrah, which is both against the occupation and Zionism in general, but also it's about evictions of families, of Palestinian families in the neighborhood in favor of Jewish settlers that take their homes. And Israeli Jewish solidarity activists have been a part of these demos since the beginning, since 2009. And there were ups and downs in terms of how the police reacts to this. There are times that there were a lot of arrests and a lot of violence, and other times that there was less. But in the last few months, the Israeli police started enforcing the complete ban on Palestine flags, on raising the Palestine flag. And we saw it especially in the personally, we saw it especially in the Sheikh Jarrah demos. And every week, locals, Palestinians from Sheikh Jarrah and from the area, and solidarity activists were arrested, and there was a lot of police violence. And sadly, since the war started, since October 7th, the demos don't take place at all. For the first time since 2009, because people are barely allowed to sit in the streets in East Jerusalem these days without being arrested or subjected to police violence, and let alone protest or raise their voice. So to answer the questions, if this type of activism is still doable, I mean, it's still happening, but what we can do and how much we can affect the situation is decreasing, feels like every day. It feels like our power in front of the Israeli forces are getting weaker every day, and it's hard.
Yeah, and for whatever this counts, like the Israeli state has said, has made protests illegal because they consider that it pulls resources away from what they're doing in Gaza or in parts of the West Bank more actively as military engagements?
Well, first of all, maybe it's important to say that in the West Bank, it's not a new thing. Any kind of demonstration is illegal under the occupation. Since the occupation, since 67, since the occupation itself. And when Palestinians demonstrate in the West Bank, the Israeli army almost always uses rubber bullets, tear gas, stun grenades, and sometimes live ammunition. So in the West Bank, it's nothing new that demonstrations are illegal.
More so, what I meant was that I heard that the Israeli state is saying protests in 48, I guess, are illegal because it pulls resources from the military activities that they're doing in the other occupied territories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure about the legal stance of the Israeli state about demonstrations right now. I know that they use a lot of laws that can be used in war times, which they do anyway in the West Bank, but now they also use it inside 48. But on the ground, we see that they don't allow, they practically don't allow it. It's true. The first demo that I personally joined was on Thursday. I mean, since October 7th, was on Thursday. It wasn't even, it's hard to call it a demonstration at all, actually. We just stood there with, in front of the, I mean, maybe I would not say the name of the place anyway. We just stood with, but with empty signs and black tape on our mouth. And we didn't say anything. Immediately the police responded with batons and fists and kicking, and some people were injured. They just chased us across the city for an hour. In Tel Aviv at the same time, there was a protest and the police arrested 20 people. And if we talk about Palestinians who want to demonstrate inside 48, then they arrest people before the demonstrations even begin. They arrested 3 ex-parliament members, 3 Palestinian ex-parliament members, and just for trying to plan a demonstration against the war. So it never came to be. So yeah, I mean, practically they don't really allow any kind of not only demonstration, any raising of voice against what's going on. I mean, I can expand about some stories from the recent weeks, like a friend, a Jewish activist friend, was arrested from his home because someone on the street saw a sign on his balcony, a sign that's an anti-occupation sign. And this person on the street called the police. The police came and arrested him brutally. And they like tore the sign and like they took some little Palestine flags that they found there. Like he was arrested for several hours and harassed by the cops. Like they said terrible stuff to him before he was released that night. And a teacher was arrested because of stuff he posted online against the war and criticizing the Israeli military. He was arrested for 4 days, and then the court decided to let him go after 4 days. And they banned him from using social media. And both stories are about Jewish dissidents. So if we're talking about Palestinian dissidents, we know many people were fired or arrested or both just because they posted something online. And like I said about those ex-parliament members, there are many stories like that. So yeah, that's the situation right now.
The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CCN.
The Anarchist Radio Berlin.
From across the pond.
So it's the Anarchist Radio Berlin.
With audios in English, Spanish and German.
And please,
don't mention the war.
You can find us at channelzeronetwork.com and aradio-berlin.org.
This is the Final Straw Radio, airing on the Pacifica Network, and you're listening to our interview with Jewish Anti-Zionist anarchist living in so-called Israel. The transcript will soon be available at tfsr.wtf/zines.
When you, just to step back for a second, when you were saying that it's kind of hard to tell the difference between settlers and the army or the police, it's the position or the situation for Israeli citizens that they have to take some sort of time in one of the government services, and usually that's in police or military, right?
True. Yeah, I mean, every Jewish Israeli citizen has to do almost 3 years. I mean, for men, it's almost 3 years. For the women, it's almost 2 years in the military and sometimes in the police. And yeah, border police.
Obviously, that there's like staffing that resolves, but that also seems like it would be a function of creating an us versus them, of like integrating people into a nationalist position that supports the occupying force emotionally, as well as integrating them into policing Arab and Palestinian bodies and life.
Definitely. Yeah, we all grow up like all Jewish Israelis, except for ultra-Orthodox Jews, which is a different story. But if we talk about like secular or light religious Jews in Israel, then we all grow up in a very militaristic and nationalist Israeli society. Like everything is aiming towards going to the army when you become 18, like kindergarten, the school. Like for instance, there are like programs almost in every school, like a joint program of the army and the school that like students go to like field days and training with the military. And also, if at all people learn Arabic in high school, then they learn it for the purposes of the intelligence of the Israeli military. Like explicitly, it's not something that's like hidden or anything. It's soldiers come and teach classes sometimes. And yeah, for sure, like I think one of the successes of this regime, the Zionist regime, is because so many people here go to the army, and they identify like completely with also mentally with the state and with the army, and they see every criticism of the army as a criticism of themselves or their families. That's why I'm so grateful personally that I didn't go to the army.
Considering how hard the state and successful the state is, the Zionist state, at integrating people into it emotionally, physically, familially, socially, like, can you talk about instances, maybe even just generalized, when people such as yourself decided to speak out or like broke with that consensus idea? What sort of, anecdotally, what sort of examples like have created circumstances where people haven't been allowed or allowed themselves to integrate in? Like, there have been movements in the past, like the Refuseniks, through various iterations to not join the military or to not conduct certain operations. And I haven't heard about that sort of thing in a decade. I wonder if you have, any sense of if there's a way to break the settler mindset, at least, because that seems like a first step towards some sort of like solidarity.
Oh, so first of all, if we talk about refusal in the last decades, or there is a movement of people who refuse to go to the army. They even have a name. They're called Mesalvot. You can find them online on Instagram or Facebook or whatever. It's a group of young people who decide not to join the army. Many of them are also active in the West Bank or in East Jerusalem against the occupation. So that's important to say. But in general, unfortunately, very few people break away from this mindset. I personally was kind of lucky, I guess, because my mom is not Zionist. She didn't talk to me a lot about that as a kid, but it definitely helped. She did talk to me sometimes about that. And I can say about myself that when there was another massacre in Gaza by Israel in 2008, 2009, I just started reading online, I know, a lot, like about occupation and resistance to the occupation. And as soon as I became 18, I just decided to go and join one of the groups that are active in the West Bank. And I think then breaking away with Zionism itself as an ideology comes to us from learning about the Nakba, mostly because you realize that the state was built on ethnic cleansing, on massive ethnic cleansing, and Jews didn't come here to an empty land. And they actually, again, built a state on kicking out hundreds of thousands of people. And then you also go to the West Bank and meet people who became refugees 2 or 3 times in their lives because they were kicked out in 48 and then again in 1867 or after that. And like there has been a lot of ethnic cleansing going on in the West Bank since the occupation in 67. You start seeing everything through this perspective, and then also when you walk around and see old houses in Jerusalem or in many other cities, and you realize that people used to live there, and you see everything through this lens. But everyone gets to it differently, I think. I think obviously today the internet is a big part of it. Like if we talk about, like you said, the Refuseniks like 20 or 30 years ago, they didn't have the internet. They could read about and watch videos of stuff that's going on in the occupied territories, and can really appreciate how they came to this like decision not to serve in the military. And back then also the percentage of people who didn't go to the military was much smaller even than today. Like it was a very, very rare thing.
You mentioned also before some of the consequences Israeli citizens that had been anti-Zionist Israeli citizens that had been protesting, such as being batoned or beaten by the police or arrested for a day or even 4 days in some instances. I wonder if you could speak about what you know about
the repercussions for some of the Palestinians that are arrested for resisting currently. I was recently listening to the latest episode of It's Going Down podcast, where Scott Campbell spoke with a Palestinian activist in the West Bank. And the guest spoke about mass arrests and administrative sentences for Palestinians for things such as simple as putting things on social media or materials found on their phones when they get stopped at the many, many checkpoints that they have to go through in the West Bank or in other communities. Yeah, I'm not sure if you could speak to the difference in repercussions that different people experience in that way.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, because I'm not a Palestinian and I don't go as often in the last few weeks to the West Bank as before, maybe I'm not the best person to answer that, but I can say what I know. First of all, in general, even the tool of administrative detention is a tool that's being used only on Palestinians. And this tool allows Israel to arrest people on the basis of the fear they would maybe do something, and not based on something they already did. And this almost never happens to Jewish Israeli citizens. And Israel uses this tool against Palestinians in huge amounts. Like, I think recently a couple of thousands Palestinians are being held using administrative detention. And that's not a new tool, but recently it's being used a lot more, and probably for longer sentences. I mean, it's not exactly sentences, because people who are being held under administrative detention, they don't go to court, to regular courts like Israeli citizens would. They're tried in military courts, and these courts have almost 100% conviction rate. So this whole process is like nothing like the process of a trial as known in like democracies, if we can call them that. And many people I heard from friends in the West Bank, when they just go around a soldier system, and the first thing the soldier does is take their phone and see if they even watched like a video or saw a photo from Gaza, from the war. And it is considered illegal now to do that if you're a Palestinian, even to watch a video. So then they either arrest the person or they break his phone. I even heard about incidents of breaking the phone on people's heads. Obviously, a lot of violence. Also, the freedom of movement in the West Bank is even more restricted now. Like, people that I know didn't go to work for weeks because the entrance to the places that they live were blocked. And even after they were not blocked anymore, they're just scared to go around. It means lots of people lose their jobs and their ability to provide for their families. So yeah, also there's a lot of raids. Like, even people don't go around. There's a lot of raids. Like, the army and settlers just go into villages, into towns, into cities, and arrest people from their homes. It's not like there's anywhere really safe in the West Bank right now. Even when you're not talking about Gaza, where obviously nowhere there is safe in the West Bank right now. This is the situation.
It seems like the closer, the more integrated people get across that boundary that the settler state draws between settler and Palestinian, the harsher the consequences for settlers, whereas the consequences have always been harsh for the Palestinians because the settler state just doesn't want them to exist. I wonder, as things have escalated to such a war as they are right now, like, what does that mean for what can anti-Zionist settlers do? How can, like, if protests aren't possible in the street, people are being beaten up for having a Palestinian flag. Do you see any possible directions of struggle that anti-Zionist Jews can participate in that's effective?
Well, I think there's 2 different or 3 different areas where we are active. One is inside 48, including Jerusalem, for instance. and the second is the West Bank, and the third is online. So all three are harder right now because, like you said, inside 48, demonstrations are not really allowed to happen, and yet people try. Also, there is a difference between how the police in Jerusalem responds and the police in other places responds. Like the police in Jerusalem is especially brutal, and we have to think how we respond to the recent events here, see if we can do stuff a little bit differently, and also to protect ourselves, because it's not like we weren't beaten before or weren't subjected to violence before and arrests, but I think now it's more dangerous. So we have to think like how we could also protect ourselves, which we usually don't. We didn't think through this. We didn't think like that until now as much. And in the West Bank, there is still solidarity activists around doing protective presence. Also, like you can read about what happened in a place called Wadi Sik a week after October 7th. It's one of those villages that there's been protective presence of solidarity activists for several months because of settler violence, and that day army and settlers came together, and they just took all the activists to one place, and they beat them. They took them to a tent, and they let like armed settlers guard them there so they don't get out and they don't document. Like they broke all the cameras and the phones, either broke them or took them. And all the Palestinian men, the soldiers and the settlers, took to a different place, and just there's horrible stories about what happened there, like brutal assaults. And yeah, I mean, there was an article in Haaretz, the Israeli journal, about this. So some of my friends were there, and they heard from them also personally what happened, but they didn't see everything. So that's an example of how also in the West Bank our activity is becoming more and more, well, harder, and we feel weaker and weaker in front of what's going on. We still enjoy our privileges as Jews, as Israeli citizens, in terms of, like I said, when we are arrested, we're tried in a court and not in a military court and treated better. But it seems like also on the West Bank, they don't let us do what we more or less managed to do before. There were always problems, of course, always. There was violence, always. There were arrests, always. But yeah, I mean, it's getting, the opportunities to affect the realities get like smaller and smaller, for sure. And online, like I said, people, even Jewish Israeli citizens, were arrested for posting stuff. So also not only arrested, there is a big right-wing nationalist, obviously a big right-wing nationalist movement in Israel, and one of their main targets right now is activists. So they look for stuff that people are posting, and they share their info, doxing, and all this kind of stuff. So all three areas are, I mean, on the other hand, we don't really know what's going to happen, and we have to keep trying. I mean, like I said, we still enjoy privileges. We still can raise our voices more than Palestinians can. We just have to keep trying and find new ways and creative ways to do that. Yeah, I mean, especially in comparison to what Palestinians are going through.
So being that, again, like the U.S. is a settler colonial state that has a lot of ties, both because of dual citizenship, as well as military and business and governmental ties between the two states. For instance, I know this, like the struggle against Cop City in Atlanta in the U.S. has been a struggle that has like partially been defined by the fact that police here train and share tactics with police and military in Israel, like that awareness is there, that there's a connection between the two. I wonder if you know of any or have any ideas about places, ways, points of pressure that people in the so-called US or abroad could apply pressure to not only like call for a ceasefire, but press, towards Palestinian liberation, which seems like a whole nother conversation, I guess, or like huge steps beyond just getting the current incursions to stop. Do you have any ideas about how internationals could help?
I mean, you can look at what Palestine Action has been doing for several years in the UK. They have a specific goal in mind. Like they said that they want to focus on an achievable goal, and while also talking about in general ending Zionist colonialism and the occupation, but they have an achievable goal, which is shutting down Elbit factories in the UK, and they succeeded in doing so. Like at least, I don't remember exactly how many factories were shut down, but they managed to shut down at least one or two. I think the US is probably harder because, I mean, as a state, it considers itself to be the biggest ally of Israel or something, and many people in the US are supportive of Israel. And I don't really know how the Palestine Solidarity movement looks like in the US, actually. But applying pressure to governments so far seems not very, it didn't bring a lot of success so far. Not in the US, not in Europe. So, we know they don't care. We know that Joe Biden doesn't care. But if there are mass demonstrations that make people realize what's going on, then that's a lot. Also, maybe, like you said, focusing on like the Elbit factories in the UK. I know that there was a ship that was blocked in the US, right? I'm not sure where.
Yeah, it was
last week
blocked for a little bit from loading in Oakland, I think. And then later people attempted to block it in Tacoma in Washington, but I think it was able to load maybe offshore, load weapons up.
Mm-hmm. So these kinds of actions sound really important. It's kind of stuff that we can never dream of doing here. It's not like we would be shot at. I think like it's not possible. So if people in the US, in Europe, can use the privileges and the fact that there is a little bit more room to express yourself in these countries, like I don't know how much, but a little bit more than here, then of course do so. And I think another important thing is reading and sharing Palestinian voices, and I can list a few names of Palestinian activists in the West Bank. People can follow. We can write it down in the description, or I can say their names.
Both.
So several activists from Masafriyata area. Adra Ali Awad, Sami Horeini, and Yusuf Samoud, and Auda Hassalim, and Ayman Reb was active mostly in the Jordan Valley in the east of Ramallah. It's really important that these people were, not only that their voices are heard, but that they're known worldwide, because they are under threat personally, because Israel targets non-violent activists. Israel likes to say that it fights terrorism, but I think the states, they prefer the violent struggle over the non-violent one, and we can see it how in the way they treat non-violent activists and also press. I would also recommend following Active Stills, which is a cooperative of photographers, Palestinian and Jewish, that are also in Gaza and in the West Bank, and they're really cool.
Yeah, I guess That's the questions that I had. Thank you very much for having this conversation, and in English. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And if there's any other resources that you want to send to go into the show notes, then I'm happy to include them. And if
I will send you links to the maybe Instagram accounts of the people I mentioned.
Yeah, that'd be great.
If I think about anything else. Thank you so much.
Until Palestine is free, I'm gonna keep on asking. Killing kids and refugees, it's a lawful action. Iron Dome, destroying homes, Goliath's guns against David Stones, all played out on your TV screen. Soldiers dancing in the street, moving to the Nazi beat. Women scream and stave off defeat. Humanity is in retreat. Iron Dome, destroying homes. Goliath's guns against David Stones. All played out on your TV screen. Palestine is free, I'm gonna keep on asking. Killing kids and refugees, it's a lawful action. Iron Dome, destroying homes. Goliath's guns against David Stone, all played out on your TV screen.
This is the Final Straw Radio. Up next, you'll hear a segment by A Radio Berlin, a co-member of the Channel Zero network, as well as the A Radio network with the Final Straw, which is about a repression of anti-fascists recently under the far-right Hungarian administration of Victor Orban. This also appeared in the November 2023 episode of Bad News, Angry Voices from Around the World, which is the monthly English language podcast from the A Radio network. Past and future episodes are up on a-radio-network.org and are also linked in the show notes.
On February 11th this year, around 2,000 fascists marched through Budapest on the so-called Day of Honor. In addition to anti-fascist counter-protests, there were also attacks on Nazis, some of whom suffered serious injuries according to police reports. Unfortunately, 2 anti-fascists are currently in jail in Hungary awaiting trial. We spoke to people from the solidarity group for the 2 imprisoned anti-fascists. Can you explain very briefly what the Day of Honor in Budapest is all about?
Yeah, so the Day of Honor in Budapest is a national socialist commemoration event, so it's attended by Nazis from different corners all over Europe. I think the Hammerskins and Combat 18 are in the background. These are really tough Nazi terrorists, and in Hungary there's also the Legio Hungaria. And they commemorate an attempt by the Wehrmacht to break out in February 1945. At the time, the Wehrmacht and Hungarian auxiliary troops were surrounded by the Red Army in a castle, and the Nazi myth says that they broke out of this castle in a heroic manner, in their opinion, in order to break through the encirclement and then somehow ran away from the castle. Whatever. Funnily enough, the real commander somehow fucked off somewhere else. They then tried to fight their way in a relatively long march, something like 60 kilometers or something, to then join other Nazi troops. The Nazis who have been holding events here for around 25 years are commemorating this. And this is, so to speak, one of several larger Nazi commemorative events in Europe, where you can still openly glorify the Nazis. The demonstration traditionally started at this castle. Important cadres from Germany also come here, the Third Way, NPD, and so on, but also Hammerskins. They walk part of this march route, which they think was an attempt to break out. Funnily enough, however, it's still a very well-recognized event, somehow even in Hungary itself, and sometimes even ordinary citizens join in. This year there were around 2,000 people. The march was also partially banned this year, and they weren't allowed to start at the castle, but started a bit outside the city. It was banned half-heartedly. But the ban can also be seen as a bit of a success for the anti-fascist counter-mobilization. There's a campaign called Stop Nazi Glorification, in which Austrian, German and Hungarian left-wing radicals and anti-fascists have joined forces for several years to protest against this event. Because, as I said, it's one of the last refuges for Nazi glorification. And this year several hundred people could mobilize there, who tried to occupy the starting point of the traditional demonstration, even with the help of the police. But at least it was possible to ensure that the Nazis were not allowed to set off from there. And you have to see the arrest or the prosecution of the various people who either have warrants out for their arrests or are already in prison in the context of the Hungarian government wanting to delegitimize the counter-protests.
You just said there are people about whom arrest warrants are open. Anti-fascists are in custody. Can you briefly say what the people are accused of?
There are 2 comrades who are in custody right now in Hungary, and one that was released. These are Tobi and Ilaria, who have been in custody in Hungary since February, and another comrade who has been released. There are accusations against these 3 people, the 2 who are in pre-trial detention and 1 person who is back in Germany. They are accused of being members of a criminal organization. And added to this, there is also dangerous bodily harm. And they had a very strange accusation to begin with that doesn't exist in Germany. It's a very strange thing. Something that was somehow new in Hungary, or maybe not new. I don't know actually how long it's been around.
So originally the Italian comrade Ilaria was charged with the criminal offense of violence against the community in several instances and armed. This is interesting in that it is a criminal law paragraph that was actually introduced to protect so-called minorities, i.e. in particular to punish violence against LGBTQI people, against Roma, against racially discriminated people, against people with disabilities, so to speak, to recognize the particularly seriousness of attacking such people. And interestingly, in this case, Ilaria has now been accused of attacking Nazis. A minority worthy of protection. It was said that they had committed hate crimes against Nazis, or had been involved in it, so to speak, had committed violence against them. I think that this was also initially investigated against Tobi, the other German comrade who is in custody. The case against him was dropped relatively quickly because the evidence was very thin. Ilaria's case is still being pursued. According to the public prosecutor's office in Hungary, there's more evidence that she did this. Now the indictment has also been published 3 days ago on October 31st. No, not published, but only announced in a press release. We don't even have the indictment yet. We don't know exactly what it says. But what has been published in the media so far is that Ilaria has been accused in a case of dangerous bodily harm, as the comrade said, in several cases, still also while being armed. I think in 5 cases with 6 injured Nazis, so to speak. And now, according to these press releases, there are 14 more European arrest warrants against other comrades, including from Germany, Syria, and another country. But many of them were already wanted before. But now there are official arrest warrants in connection with these proceedings. And the interesting thing is that the indictment and the investigations from the German Antifa-Ost proceedings are being relied on very heavily. It is constantly mentioned somehow. So that's also an indication that it's all based on very thin circumstantial evidence, because they claim that these 3 people were all part of the group around Lina E., as she is then somehow officially named. They would have gone there together to commit crimes. And the only thing they have left to somehow prove this is above all to rely on investigation files and the indictment from Dresden, because otherwise they have hardly anything to convict people.
Can you tell me a bit more about the status of the proceedings? The indictment is pending. What else is there? Are there any trial dates yet? Whatever that involves.
There are no trial dates yet. We also don't know when the trial will start. That's a bit up in the air. First, we have to wait until the indictment is actually issued. It may then say something different from the press release. But what we've heard from lawyers so far is that the trial could drag on for a year or so. A long trial is somehow to be expected. And we also have to somehow assume and see the context a bit that this is a very authoritarian state and a state that is undergoing such authoritarian changes. It is very clear that Antifas are seen as official political opponents of the Hungarian government. This has also been seen in other cases where activists have stood up for emancipatory causes. The media is heavily dominated by the Fidesz party, Victor Orban's ruling party. There is also a lot of pressure right now to condemn them. This is a highly publicized issue and the influence on the judicial system is also relatively large. There's a special authority to make the public prosecutors dependent on the government, so to speak. We have been told, more or less informally by lawyers, that there are only a few judges left who do not toe to the Orban line and strongly follow the government's line. We are expecting a political trial because of the political situation in Hungary, and it is simply very uncertain what will come out of it. In other words, whether a conviction will follow, even with very poor evidence or circumstantial evidence. That makes it totally uncertain for us, and what we can expect for our friends and comrades who are in prison there. And that is definitely a burden.
And another thing that is of course also very exciting and also worrying is the cooperation with the German authorities, which has been very strong from the very beginning. For example, in the house searches that happened immediately after the arrests, and then also over the course of the last 6 months in Berlin, in Thuringia and in Saxony, it has been a very tight cooperation with Hungary. The fact that there are these 3 accusations of a criminal organization in connection with the Lina E trial means that there's hardly any real evidence or anything, at least that we've been told by the lawyers. And yet people are being held there because of this and under terrible conditions.
And in this regard, it can already be said that it emerges from a small inquiry that in March of this year, independent proceedings were also opened in Germany against a group of people because of these apparent criminal offenses in Budapest. At the same time, however, it is suspected that there is much more going on. In other words, that there are other criminal proceedings being conducted here. But at the moment, the leading investigative authority, the Dresden Public Prosecutor's General's Office, is not releasing any information about what they are actually doing. It's also interesting that the LKA Saxony is also leading the investigation on the police side. In other words, the same police authority that led the investigation in the Antifa Ost case. So that one can assume that the prosecution is politically motivated. In any case, it is simply an attack on the anti-fascist movement. But it is interesting to see that there is a strong overlap with the previous police authorities in Berlin. The passing on of information to the Hungarian investigation authorities, who, among other things, gave them access to the files in the Antifa Ost trial and sent them to the indictment. We don't know exactly how deep the cooperation between the German and Hungarian authorities is, but it is definitely clear that there is cooperation.
So how can we support the 2 people in prison in a very concrete way, but perhaps also you as a group?
First of all, of course, it's a big financial outlay. On the one hand, these proceedings will take place in Hungary. There are travel costs, at least double or triple the lawyer's fees, translation costs, costs for support and so on. Overall, it is an expensive procedure in any case, especially if we also assume that the procedure will probably take at least a year. For the time being, we are not assuming that Toby will somehow be released during this time, but will remain in custody. I think it would be the same for Ilaria. That's exactly why we always need financial support. That is very important. Donations can definitely go to the Rote Hilfe. There's an account with the keyword Budapest. You can find the account details in the show notes. There's also a separate account for the Italian comrade, which you will also find in the show notes. And it's great if you donate there. If you organize parties and donate, or if you can organize money in some other way and donate it, or send it to us in some other way. That's one thing, in any case. At the same time, of course, we also need political solidarity work. So keep an eye out for announcement of demonstrations, rallies, or events. You can also write us to make requests for events, for example, to which we will then come or send you material. We also produce informational material on the subject, which we are happy to send out to raise awareness. Overall, I think it's important to see this as an attack on the anti-fascist movement, which has to fight just as internationally as the Nazis are doing it, for example there, when they are gathering in Budapest. And we all know that in the current political situation, we as anti-fascists, as the radical left, are not exactly in the best position. And it is now important that we stick together, that we try to cushion such attacks together and support each other. That's why you should come to the events and demonstrations. Find out more, for example, at budapest-solidarity.net, the website for the two prisoners. You can also find the donation address there. You can also find further information about the trial and the political work. There's also more information at basc.news. This is not just about the people in custody. The third comrade from Germany is also awaiting trial. There are also people who are out and about and who naturally don't want to go to trial in a right-wing authoritarian state that wants to send Antifascists to prison anyway. That's why there too solidarity is needed for them. Find out about it. They need our help too.
You can find information on the donation accounts at budapest-solidarity.net. Further information on the case and all antifascists persecuted in this context can also be found at basc.news.
And now some words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
Benjamin Netanyahu is a fucking liar. I know I keep talking about Palestine, and you're probably overwhelmed and oversaturated by the volume of information about it. But I have to get this off my chest. It feels to me like every time I hear representatives of the Israeli government talk about this, I'm being gaslit. It's incredibly maddening and frustrating. I imagine a handful of Israeli administrators who think they're smarter than everyone else in the world, formulating official responses that are designed to make Hamas and the Palestinian people look like a collection of DC comic book villains contained in Arkham Asylum on the Gaza Strip, assuming that all of us consumers of information are incapable of fact-checking or critically questioning discernible inconsistencies. And it's now a constant pattern, particularly in the statements of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Let's deal first with how Netanyahu has characterized Hamas's attack on October 7th as war crimes. He has repeatedly described Hamas's attack on civilian Israeli settlements as war crimes. The problem here is Hamas is not a nation state, and Hamas is not in charge of a nation state because Israel, and particularly the administration of Benjamin Netanyahu, has done everything in its power to obstruct and derail the possibility of a Palestinian state. Since there is no Palestinian state, Hamas is not a state actor. Reasonably, only state actors commit war crimes. What I mean is, Belgium can commit war crimes because it's a nation state with the power to declare and conduct war, but the Belgian soccer team cannot. Whatever the Belgian soccer team might do, however reprehensible, its acts cannot be construed as war crimes. It's just European athletes on vacation behaving badly. Curious, Israeli officials attribute an implied nation-state characterization to Hamas, using the term war crimes when convenient to justify the false sense that Hamas acts on behalf of Palestine. And therefore, the war that Israel wages in response is just tit for tat. It seems the war crimes characterization by Israel is strategic, and the logic that since Palestine via Hamas committed war crimes, and since their own war crimes are the inception of this conflict, they can't very well snivel about others' war crimes. And so discussion of Israeli war crimes never really begins. But this is just a tip of the iceberg in the gaslighting. At the start of the conflict, Israel conceded to aid being delivered to Gaza, but no fuel. And then they obstructed delivery of the aid anyway. Netanyahu's justification for excluding fuel was his assertion that Israeli intelligence knew that Hamas had thousands upon thousands of gallons of fuel already stockpiled. Now, how they could possibly know this aside, let's just assume it's true. Hamas has a gazillion gallons of fuel. Since they already have it, why not deliver fuel to the Palestinian people? Isn't there a practical and logistical limit to how much fuel Hamas could stockpile? And since their tanks are presumably full to the brim, what harm is there in providing fuel to the Palestinian people? The argument just doesn't make sense. Unless, of course, the ulterior motive is to cause death and discomfort to the Palestinian people. In the absence of electricity and in the absence of fuel to run generators, even the hospitals are without power, and so people die. Last Sunday on Meet the Press, Benjamin Netanyahu said Israel had shipped incubators to the Palestinian hospitals to save babies. As he spoke, video of babies taken out of incubators was already circulating. The issue isn't the absence of incubators, it's the absence of electricity and fuel to run them. You can't tell me the Israeli government didn't know that. Now Israel is even implying that hospitals are legitimate targets because Hamas positions their control centers in the tunnels beneath the hospitals. Again, gaslighting. The reason Hamas would reasonably congregate in the tunnels below the hospitals is that Israel has already bombed even residential neighborhoods into oblivion, and likely the tunnels underneath everything have been compromised. There is nowhere else but underneath the hospitals. The rest of northern Gaza is a charred moonscape. So Israel complains of Hamas militants ending up underneath the hospitals after Israel itself has deliberately herded them there, seemingly with the intention of justifying their own anticipated war crimes in attacking the hospitals. Netanyahu claims Israel takes every precaution to avoid civilian deaths, when objectively, the conduct of Israel's obliteration of Palestine makes it pretty clear that maximizing civilian deaths seems to be the goal. It's simply impossible to kill thousands of people by accident. In the same breath, Netanyahu said they can't reward Hamas for using civilians as human shields, suggesting that Israel is doing a favor to the world by erasing a clearly defined boundary in the rules of warfare. Hamas isn't the target. This is clear from Benjamin Netanyahu's own admission that Israel will control the Palestinian territories indefinitely when the smoke clears. Netanyahu claims that this planned Israeli control is necessary because of the insecurity Israel experiences if anyone else is in charge of the Palestinian territories. But this too is gaslighting. It was Netanyahu who came into office promising to undo what his predecessors accomplished, who engaged in deliberate provocations and expanding settlements in violation of the Oslo agreements and the Camp David Accords, and who drove the Palestinian people to embrace Hamas on the extreme and abandon the PLO moderates. So framing the Palestinians as dishonest brokers, or worse, as ruthless and dangerous animals, is cynical, opportunistic, and simply untrue. He says the extremists have to be rooted out, while he bombs Palestinian children and drives the population to a greater extreme. It's in this context that worldwide anti-Semitism is on the rise, and the Israeli government references to this trend seem to be an implied argument that anti-Semitism is rising simply because media and others are questioning the morality and legitimacy of the Israeli response. This seems to be a veiled implication that everyone has a duty to stop calling them on their shit, to stop interrogating the motives and actions of the Israeli state and instead give them a free pass. The reality is, when officials like Benjamin Netanyahu speak for a self-defined Jewish state and continue to mislead and flim-flam the world with half-truths, he himself is feeding the bigoted tropes and stereotypes of Jewish deceit and nefarious plots that are always at the very foundations of anti-Semitism. This uptick in anti-Semitism is a response, however irrational, to the conduct of the self-defined Jewish state. And it's often ordinary, well-intending Jewish people in the course of their regular lives who end up victimized in the blowback, as they were on October 7th, and as they continue to be in the heightened outrage against Israeli war crimes and Israeli officials' cynical reinventions of reality to justify those war crimes. This shit needs to stop. The war crimes need to stop. So do the self-serving falsehoods designed to justify them. Aid needs to flow unfettered into Gaza. Food, water, medicine, fuel. International assistance, to include hospital ships, need to be given access. A timetable for establishing Palestine as a sovereign and autonomous state has to be set. And if all those conditions cannot be met, the United States needs to immediately cease its millions of dollars a day in foreign aid to Israel. The U.S. has the power to end this right now. It's up to us to persuade the U.S. to end this. Let's be creative, imaginative, and assertive. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain from the Super Duper Uber Mega Ultra Hyper Turbo Multi Maxi Max in Youngstown, Ohio. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
You can still write Sean at his new old new again address at Sean Swain number A243205 OSP Youngstown 878 Coitesville Hubbard Road, Youngstown, Ohio 44505. You can find his past writings, updates on his case, hear his past audio, find out how to get his books, plus ways to contribute to his legal defense fund at seanswain.org.
This is The Final Straw Radio. This show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at TFSR, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books. Located at 1022 Haywood Road in West Asheville, Firestorm Books is a worker-owned cooperative in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a catalog of Firestorm's books and zines, plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop.